Well, welcome to this second of our global events during Influence Month. I'm very pleased to welcome Alastair Campbell as our guest, someone who's probably best known for his time in British politics during the late 90s and early noughties, but more recently has also been heavily involved in a number of different campaigns, as well as an amount of advisory work overseas. So welcome, Alastair. Welcome to Arup. Very glad that you were able to join us. Thank you very much. Alastair, I wonder if I might start just to probe a little bit that transition in your career. So, as I said, you're probably best known to our audience for the work that you did with Tony Blair and the government of the day back then. But since then, you've had a variety of different roles. And I think, as someone in a position of power, perhaps in those days, you were a receiver of many people trying to influence you and trying to influence the government. And yet, since then, you've become the influencer, if you like. You've become the person who's trying to persuade governments now to think about mental health, for example, in different ways and institute different kinds of policy approaches. So how have you transitioned? How have you dealt with that kind of difference in approach?
Badly, I would say. I find it, to be absolutely frank, I find it very, very difficult. And it's true that when you're in government, in the position I was in, kind of seen as being right at the right hand of the Prime Minister, you are bombarded with people who are trying to influence, but also you do remain an influencer within, because the point about government and what's happening inside government is that part of my job was to try to give the sense of it being kind of smooth and seamless and strategic, but actually within government the whole time there are so many different layers of conflict and division and argument, and they're, by the way, they're not all negative. Conflict can be very negative, but it's not always like that. Sometimes the conflicts are real and necessary. And coming out of that, and what made it more difficult was actually that I had both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who, when he took over, kind of keeping me involved at a time when I was trying to pull out. So actually it became, that's the honest answer, I found it very, very difficult on all sorts of levels: practical, personal, psychological. I found it very, very difficult. Giving that up is not easy. Yeah.
And what about now, the role that you play in, I think probably one of the loudest voices, certainly in the UK, around the issue of mental health. You're constantly trying to contribute to that debate, trying to influence government. Do you deploy a different kind of tactic? How do you gain influence in your role now to make progress?
I mean, I think another example I thought the one you were going to mention was, say, in relation to Brexit, something like the People's Vote campaign, trying to get the second referendum, failing, sadly. But I think that you are using very different methods, but you still have to deploy a strategy. And whether you're in government or you're trying to influence government, being strategic, I still think is the single most important thing. So, for example, with something like the mental health debate, I'll try, I know you've got an international audience, and I'll try not to get too parochial or too political, but I don't really think that this British government gets the mental health agenda. Therefore, the strategy is as much about influencing the public debate in the hope that then might influence them. So I think it's a slightly different approach. So, for example, I'm talking to you this evening, I'm doing an online event with one is actually with a vicar who's trying to influence the government on the poverty agenda, and then one with the shadow mental health minister, because that's another way. Sometimes we were talking earlier about sometimes you can influence the government through getting the opposition to take a different approach. So that but the most important thing is that sense of having a clear objective. My objective in mental health is to change the lens, change the way that we think about mental health, change the way that we talk about it, be more open about it, so that actually that can then lead to change in the public policy sphere as well. But the tactics that you deploy for that would be very different according to what country you're in, what sort of government you've got. So if you go to parts of the developing world, where I was in Ghana a while back, Now I think, if I get the figures right, I think there were tens of thousands of faith healers, and you could count psychiatrists on a couple of hands in the whole country.
Yeah.
Now, you're going to deploy a completely different strategy there.
Yeah.
Trying to get to the same place.
Yeah.
So it will depend where you are and who you're dealing with.
So I'm intrigued actually. During your time in government, it was really a period post sort of social media, or certainly social media to the power and influence and extent that it exists today. With such power, I suppose, at people's fingertips on their phones, is the extent to which you can influence public opinion much greater, or at least the extent to which public opinion matters much greater now, because that can be expressed so much more directly to governments?
I mean, I think you could definitely make the case, for example, that without social media, Trump may never have been president. It's entirely possible to make that case. We'll never know because you can't prove the counterfactual. And certainly I can point to campaigns that have succeeded in their objective by very cleverly and very successfully deploying social media, definitely. However, I think there's a danger that we all get so mesmerized by the change that it represents and the change of pace within the media debate that it represents, that we overlook what I still think is a basic truth.
Yeah.
The power of your argument is ultimately what has to prevail, and the power of your argument will depend upon the strength of your strategy. So I think that what's happened is that the pressures of the modern world are all to be tactical.
Yeah.
The response, to my mind, should actually to be more strategic, not less strategic. And I find that with a lot of governments around the world, and with a lot of businesses, and with a lot of campaigns, that actually they get so driven by the tactical pressure that they lose sight of strategy.
Yeah. So there's this saying that I've heard recently, that you could, some characterize today's politicians as more interested in politics than they are in government, if you like. And that plays a little bit to what you're saying there, that they become quite sort of short-sighted in their outlook. They're very much more interested, if you like, in public opinion and setting policy. And it drives an immediacy, I suppose, in the way in which they go about that. So how, within that context, does an organisation like Arup really start to think about gaining influence in government circles, really to pursue agendas and outcomes that we think are the types of agendas that are going to make, as our motto says, make the world a better place? How are we going to do that? How would you advise us to think about that kind of that challenge?
Well, first of all, in response to the first part of your question, politicians have always, it's in the word, politicians have always had to be interested in politics, and it's a totally legitimate thing for politicians to be thinking about the political context in which they're operating.
Yeah.
What I think is happening with populism, whether that's populism that we've seen with Trump, whether it's populism that we see here in the UK with Brexit and with Johnson as Prime Minister, whether it's populism that we've seen in different parts of the world, I think it's gone to a place now where what is true and what they want to be true are kind of similar in terms of the power of the motivation for those populist politicians. And that's pretty dangerous, I think, and that's the place where we're at. And I think that does make things difficult for organisations that are maybe trying to come from a position of principle and of having, as you say, wanting to make change that makes the world a better place. The first thing you have to do is decide whether you think it matters. Decide whether actually having a voice and having the ability for that voice to be heard within governments around the world, whether that matters, okay?
Yeah.
Now, lots of organisations have decided, you know what, we'll just get on with it.
Yeah.
And that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Once you've made the decision that it does matter, then I think you have to, I go back to the point I made earlier, is how do you frame your argument in a way that when government is making a decision that might impact upon what you do or want to do, you're kind of in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So you've got to say to yourself, how do we get inside their minds? And you do that with a mixture of private and public. And don't underestimate the power of the public message that you put out there.
Yeah.
And then once you've decided that's what you want to do, you have to build a strategy, and you have to build the networks, and you have to build the team that's going to put that strategy forward.
So many would say, actually, your first reference there to the companies that choose not to get involved, that perhaps that's where we should be. Many might say that because I think this world of influence has a slightly kind of murky, dark connotation to some. That it's a world that we don't quite understand. We don't necessarily need to be part of. I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, you were in government for quite some time, presumably engaging quite a lot with companies like ours, etc. How did it feel to you? I mean, what would your advice be to us?
You've got to decide for yourselves really because I think once you've decided, I don't think it is that murky, or it doesn't have to be. Look, there are parts of the world where it's very murky. Mm-hmm. There are parts of the world where, there is kind of pretty blatant corruption goes on. I've got to be honest, I think we're having a lesser version of it happening, starting to get into our government, which I think is really dangerous. And I think we've seen it in relation to some of the COVID contracts where they've used emergency legislation to sort of get rid of tendering processes and so forth. Now, but let's put that to one side for now. I think if you make that basic decision that you want to be able to influence government, then I think if you go into it thinking that it's murky, one, you won't enjoy it, and two, you won't be successful. Mm-hmm. It's actually not. If you have a good argument, then good governments will want to hear it. Mm-hmm. Now, how you then deploy that argument, frame that argument, will depend upon the sector that you're in, or in your case, the sectors that you're in, because you kind of straddle quite a few of them. And then it's a combination of getting the balance right between a public message where you're kind of out there in the debate and a private message. Now, those two are going to go together. Yeah. Because you're not going to be, I often think about, if you think about somebody like the finance minister of any government in the world, right, when they're making really big decisions for spending and taxation and planning of a budget and so forth, they are bombarded, literally bombarded with every sector, every trade organization, every trade union, big names, the media, all bombarding them. This is what you should do. Okay. Are you on the list of people whose views they think will matter? Mm-hmm. Okay. Matter in two ways. One, you can have some influence over the decision-making process, mm-hmm. and that's simply about being in that process. Yeah. That you know how to get a point over to government. And the second thing is, are you in the position where if you react adversely to what they do and what they say, they're going to care about that? Yeah, yeah. And again, it's a mixture. It's a mixture of the public and the private. There are some companies that, let me think of an example. If the British Chancellor, going through the COVID pandemic at the moment with the airline industries, right? They don't want to be under constant attack from the airline industries. Yeah, yeah. For obvious reasons. So how do those industries get their message out there? Yeah. And actually the airlines are an interesting one. On the public and the private, you've got somebody like Richard Branson, okay? Now, I think Richard Branson is particularly for somebody who's kind of, quite sort of, dyslexic and dyspraxic and all that stuff, he's actually a very effective communicator. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But I would say he's an effective strategic communicator, mm-hmm. by which I mean, you say Virgin, you say Branson, you kind of know what you're on about. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's got sense to it. It's got a feel to it. It's got a flavour. Yeah. Tony O'Reilly, Ryanair. Yeah. Very different sort of feel, but very effective. Combination of the public and the private. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's how you have to think about it. And you come from a very good start. In preparation for this, I read the Arup speech. Yeah. Okay. Now, not many companies have that sense of, and I'd never read it before. I was aware of it. Yeah. I'd never read it before. Yeah. But having read it, there's a sense of strategy in that. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So you've got a core, you've got a base for it. The question then is, okay, that's who we want to be, that's how we want to operate. How do we take that to the next level, which is taking that message, framing it in a way that when we say Arup, people know what we're talking about.
Know what we're talking about.
I mean, Branson, Virgin, they got tons and tons and tons of different companies, different products, but the message, Virgin, Branson, you know what it is.
Yeah.
So that my advice would be work out, one, do we want to have that kind of profile, sense of who we are and what we are, because that gives us influence.
Yeah.
Two, how do we do it?
So what's your reflection? You've read the speech. You see Arup, in the world today, and you've characterised that a little bit in what you've said. What's your reflection? I mean, would you be encouraging us to think that way, to use some of that strength? I mean, we've set out in our global strategy that sustainable development must be the outcome that we pursue in everything that we do, and that inevitably, I think, will change our business. It will give us new direction. But the issues that are wrapped up in sustainable development are so broad, and there are so many. It's quite, one of the challenges there are perhaps to focus. And what you're really describing is, what is it you're trying to achieve as an outcome of that influence of government, and that to an extent implies a degree of focus. How would you sort of look at Arup now within the context of today's popularism, with that kind of objective that we're wishing to set, going perhaps beyond our kind of core day-to-day business and wanting really to have an ambition to change and have greater influence? How do you marry these two things and look at us and say, yes, you should be putting yourself in front of governments, or would you be saying, perhaps think of other routes, other ways in which we can have an effect?
Well, there are other routes, but I think you should be doing all of them, and I think that for a company of your size and with the scale of your ambition, I think, and particularly with the world as it is now constructed, and with the media as it's now operates, and the way that politics is changing, I think it'd be a mistake not to be adapting to that, and not to be wanting to be part of that. And actually, if you go back to that speech, we've talked about a book I wrote about winning, and I said to you, I wish that I'd read that speech before, because a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, actually, I could feel it in there. I talk about this. I think any winning organization has to have what I call the Holy Trinity, which is strategy, leadership, and teamship. And the point is, those three can be in any order. Because without all three, none of them work. You can have the leadership, but if you have the leadership without a good team, you're nowhere. Without a strategy, both of them are nowhere. So they've got to kind of work together. Now, I just think in today's age, if part of your strategy is dependent upon the ability to influence debate and decision makers, then you have to be at the heart of it all the time. And so I would say, make that first decision. We are going to change. Because I mean, look, I think insofar as you have an established profile, reputation, I would say it's strong. Okay. But are you on that list of brands, companies, call it what you will, that is strong enough almost for the name itself to say, right, it says something? I don't think so. I don't think so. And that's because I suspect you haven't really wanted to do this, wanted to play that kind of strategic communication game. Very interesting. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the book Winners, and I really enjoyed reading it. What I particularly enjoyed, no surprise here, was your reference to Jose Mourinho, and at the time, I think it was 2015, you were talking about how he was on a downward slide, and you were hoping that he would resurrect himself, and this is the true sign of a winner, someone who could experience perhaps that downward slip and sort of almost take it on board in order to pump themselves up to kind of redeploy themselves to win again. And you make other references to the sailor Ainsley. Ben Ainsley. Classic case. I'd like to think Jose's in that position now.
Well, he's top of the league at the moment.
Absolutely, but I think this is really important for consultants, because I think one of the biggest issues with consultants, and perhaps why Arup hasn't put itself into the place that you've described, is that kind of fear of getting it wrong, the fear of failure, and the fear of what that might do to our reputation, perhaps, or the fear of, how do you recover from that? I'm really interested in that point. Is there a way in which you can develop strategies to deal with that kind of sense of not achieving what you're setting out to achieve this time round and turning that into energy to achieve it the next time round?
Well, my favourite quote, for those who aren't aware of the book, it's about winning in sport, business and politics and what you can learn from the three. And I concluded that the greatest winning mindsets are in sport, followed by business, alas, followed by politics. That's kind of where I got to. But my favourite quote in the whole book is from a guy that, and I bet you've forgotten him, as most people do, because he's not very well known. He's called Colm O'Connell. He's an Irish missionary who went to Kenya to convert Kenyans to Catholicism, and he ended up coaching the Kenyan athletic squad. And he's coached some of the greatest athletes in the world, and he said the winner is the loser who evaluates defeat properly. And I think that is the answer to your question. How do you, in a sense, if you have the mindset that says, well, I'm worried about doing that because I might fail, well, you might be worried about getting out of bed in the morning because you might fall over as you put your foot on the ground. So I think you have to want to have a strategy that is bold and ambitious. And if anything is bold and ambitious, then there are bound to be moments where it gets challenged and tested. So I think it's a question of mindset. The reason why so many of those sport, and it's interesting you alighted on, in that context, you focus straight away on two of the sports characters. And if you think about it, in sport, the only person in the book that I interviewed who never lost at what he did was Floyd Mayweather, the boxer. Now, he's lost in life, lots of stuff, and he's also won in life. But he never lost. Now, that is a very, very, very rare person. So how you adapt to failure, how you come back from a setback, I think is just part of what devising and implementing strategy is. And so inbuilt to the strategy has to be the expectation that it's not always going to go 100% according to plan. You're going to have to adapt. You're going to have to make refinements.
So here's a tricky one.
Go on.
You described your role in Vote Remain, the
People's Vote campaign.
People's Vote campaign. As a failure. You said a failure earlier on. So as we sit here on the brink of hopefully a Brexit deal being done, bringing this back to British politics, but it's a monumental week probably for British politics this week. Brexit deal will be done, hopefully. How do we turn that into success? How do we make the most of the situation we're in now, given that you haven't succeeded in what you set out to succeed, but we've got to deal with what we've got to deal with and look to the future? How do we as an organisation start to look at that as success? How do we turn it into winning?
I'm afraid you got me there. Maybe this is a mistake on my part, I don't know. I am failing to see any upside to Brexit. I just can't see it. I cannot see it as anything other than a disaster for Britain. Even, by the way, if we get a deal, because the only deal that's now available is a pretty bad one. And we all know it's going to hit us economically. It's already hitting us in terms of who and what we are as a power in the world. I think that Joe Biden's election as United States president, I think is going to complicate it even further with relation to Northern Ireland in particular. So I don't see it as anything other than a negative. Now, if you're asking Boris Johnson what he might say, then let him say it. But I'm no longer a spokesman for the government, okay? And I'm certainly not going to speak positively for something that I think is an act of national self-harm. I really do. I can't see it any other way. By the way, though, just on politics, it's interesting when you were asking that. I don't know why, but Al Gore popped into my head. And so if you think about Al Gore, and he's somebody else who's made that, he's been vice president, and then he's now trying to save the planet. His big thing now is environmental campaigning. And I interviewed him for GQ magazine. I do this monthly interview for GQ, and I interviewed him not long after Trump became president. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting thing in terms of your mindset of how you deal with political environment. So he's a politician, ex-vice president, and I said, "Are you not just absolutely petrified about what Trump being president represents to your campaign?" Mm-hmm. And he said, "You know what? We're just going to have to work around him. Mm-hmm. We're just going to have to work around him. Yeah, he's going to be difficult. Yeah, he doesn't share my politics. He doesn't share my views on the climate. We're going to have to work around them." And actually, they have kind of worked around him pretty well.
Yeah.
So the debate. Now, the reason why I find Brexit so depressing, you can't kind of work around that. The change. I feel that 2016, there were two, really big votes that happened. One delivered Brexit and one delivered Trump. Mm-hmm. The Americans have corrected their error, right? We are unable to correct our error.
Do you really believe the error has been corrected in Trump terms? I mean, Joe Biden's won more votes than any other former president, but Trump also won more votes.
Yeah.
So,
no, listen,
what's your view on that? One of the questions that's come in actually is, elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts around that, because, I think we're all thinking that this is a new era with Joe Biden, but perhaps recognizing there are 70 million voters sitting. No,
when I say, okay, that maybe I oversimplified it. When I say corrected the error, I think Trump was a terrible mistake for America and for the world. Now, that's me, right? It's not the 70 million people who voted for him. But I think that is a view fairly widely shared in most countries of the world, okay? When I say it's been corrected, what I mean by that is that Trump is a one-term president and he will be gone from the White House. He will not be gone from the public debate. Politics. He will not be gone from the debate about what the direction the Republican Party takes in the future. But at least now, that there is an experienced president in Joe Biden who will bring at least some sense of normalcy, and who will also seek to rediscover the sense of global leadership that Trump willfully gave away. Yeah. So that's what I mean by correcting the error. Whereas Brexit is happening, and it's probably going to be a generational issue. And this idea that we're all going to stop talking about Europe the day New Year comes along, forget it. This is with us now, and this debate is with us for the next generation as well as the last one.
So we've got to discover winning strategies during this period.
We do, and that means when you talk about we, individuals have to do it, regions of countries have to do it, towns and cities have to do it, and companies have to do it. And that I think a lot of it will be working round. As Gore said about climate change, we're going to have to work round this. So
there's opportunities, perhaps, and it's certainly one that I think we in Arup are very keen on is rallying around the sustainable cause, and actually sort of, I think one of the challenges with that to date has been getting the public on side with that, convincing the public that this is a good cause for them to pursue and take action themselves, etc. But it does feel like the tide has turned a little bit on that. And indeed, Biden winning the election, he made some quite bold statements about the transition from oil away, etc. And in the past, that might have brought down his election hopes. There's some signs there that perhaps that's changing. So, I mean, is there a proposition in your mind where perhaps we can use that kind of commitment to carbon reduction, to the sustainable outcomes, as a means of positioning ourselves as an organisation differently, gaining the kind of influence that you've described earlier, but at the same time, perhaps almost turning that round on governments and letting us helping them see the benefit in that because of the popular cause that sits behind that.
Definitely. And I mean, you mentioned the mental health stuff earlier. I am finding that business is taking a lead on it. Yeah. That business is recognizing that, and in some sectors you might not think this is happening, but so for example the banks and the financial services industries where they all got hit in the financial crisis, and a lot of them had suicides. Yeah. Right. That has changed their thinking. Yeah. When I talk about changing the lens, so something like the sustainable development argument. I was in Norway recently, and I was at this bank in Stavanger, and the building was just, utterly blown away by this building. Okay, and when I talked to the people within the bank, they were raving about the building as well. And then when they were telling me about the building, they were explaining how environmentally friendly it was, where all this stuff had come from, how they were actually able to operate on a way that was showing their commitment to sustainable development, not least in the building in which they were in.
Yeah.
And once you get that sense of energy in a debate, that's how you then make change. And so what will happen if you've got that sense of this is who we are, this is what we do. You've got the COP summit coming up in Glasgow.
Yeah.
If you're in government, you're thinking about that, and lots of different people are planning for it. And of course, the policy outcome is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. But along the way, they're going to be looking for different companies to have events. They're going to be wanting to get different business leaders in to talk about what their expectations for. You want to be on that list.
We need a strategy.
You want to be, the person who's at the end of the phone where somebody in government sitting there thinking, why don't we get Arup? They bang on about this a bit.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear the previous event we had last week was Nigel Topping, who is organising COP26 on behalf of the British government.
Oh, okay, good.
And we're working very closely with
him. There you go. You're already on the list then.
We are making some headway in that respect.
Excellent.
I'm just going to turn to some of the questions, if you don't mind. They're coming in thick and fast. Let's choose one or two here. How do we hold companies and governments to account for their promises regarding carbon emissions? There's a big one for you.
By the way, I'll say very little positive about Boris Johnson, but on this agenda, he does at least look like he wants to take a leadership role in it.
Yeah.
So that is a positive. The whole thing about accountability is incredibly difficult at the moment, because you've got we've seen it here we've had 4 years of it with Trump, of basically you say something's going to happen and then it doesn't, but you then talk about something else.
Yeah.
In a sense, accountability requires us to have a similar strategic approach and a long-term memory.
Yeah.
We were talking about this earlier. The other downside, I think, of the 24 News, no such thing as a deadline, relentless pressures of social media, is on the one hand, governments are getting hit the whole time, but it means they're getting hit by so many things, they can kind of pick and choose where they go. So you have to hold them accountable through process. And process, you can have your own processes. You could start to do the Arup monitor, right, where Arup says, right, we're going to track all the governments around the world and say whether they're holding up. Yeah. And you could even do, I don't know whether this is remotely in your culture, whether you could do it to other companies as well.
Yeah.
So the Arup monitor says, hey, you said you were going to do this, you've only done this. And then you just find ways of putting that out into the public debate.
Of course, that then implies, the credibility that you bring to that really comes back to the way in which you behave yourself as an organisation. And your example of the Norwegian bank there, actually the great credibility for having, taken the plunge themselves and invested in themselves and getting themselves to that position gives them the voice, gives them the credibility.
Exactly.
That.
Exactly. Yeah, so no, but listen, if you don't do it yourself, then you might as well go home.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that the people have a sense of, and maybe social media does kind of tease this out. On the one hand, you've got all the kind of conspiracy theory stuff going on over there, and you can't believe anybody. On the other hand, I think that the wisdom of crowds does suss out authenticity.
Yeah.
So if you come along and you say, right, because let's be honest, everybody talks about sustainability.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they have to.
Yeah.
Now, because it's real, and because also they know that that's where the debates move to.
Yeah.
But if you don't actually live it, and then you come along and say, we're going to keep an eye on you, we're going to monitor you, then you're finished.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've got to be better than you're even saying you are.
Absolutely. And I think we're in, as you mentioned, with the key speech, really motivating the members of Arup, and I think genuinely driving our motivation to come to work every day. I think to a great extent we're in a very strong position. To the extent we do pursue our aims, we do pursue our value, and we wear our values on our sleeve. Perhaps we don't tell the world about that. Well,
I think the thing is, if you've got it, flaunt it, and if you're proud of it, shout about it.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting when you first asked me to come and do this, and so I kind of Googled around a bit, and if you Google Arup, that speech comes up very, very high.
Yeah.
Right. And then you get to it, and there's a whole kind of thing about it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know whether you make the most of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we probably recognise that we don't, and perhaps the age has come actually, but where kind of public trust is an important aspect of what we look at. Well, describing that kind of public approach and the political approach coming together. Well, look at
what's happening now so here in the UK today we've got the first vaccine.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a 90-year-old woman up in Coventry. And I don't know if you saw. Did you see what the name of the number 2?
No.
Patient number 2 was called William Shakespeare. I mean, they should have made him number 1. But anyway, so that woman is going to be on a lot of front pages and a lot of news bulletins all over the world today. Okay. Interesting. Just think about this. So that's a deliberate choice that they've done it like that.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't done Boris Johnson with his sleeve rolled up with his knee all going. Yeah. Why is that? Because even they recognise that is not because so many people will get turned off.
Yeah.
Now, you had that last week in the States. You had Clinton, Bush, and Obama all saying that on TV they would get the jab.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that might be effective, but here we've got a debate going about whether celebrities are the people. But actually, no. Do you know what? The best people to do that?
Yeah.
90-year-old woman.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Good communication.
Yeah, it's the genuine nature of it. So there's an interesting question here about, Arup is a political organisation. We don't take sides quite deliberately. And sometimes actually that means, where we've got an opinion, we hold back a little bit in expressing that opinion because we don't want to be seen to be entering into the realms of politics. But the question here is how can we influence the agenda at top levels while still remaining out of politics, if you like? Because as you said earlier, you're encouraging us perhaps to get close, and that does mean entering the fray. How are they mutually exclusive? If we're committed to influencing policies, are we also committed to taking a political point of view? Do you think you can do the two things?
I think you can. I'm trying to think of back to Branson.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember in the 1997 election, Tony Blair as leader of the Labour Party, and Branson was launching some new train. So we went down and they did this sort of photo call together. This was during the election campaign, right?
Yeah.
And I can remember, this is all in my diaries, I can remember at the end of the day, Tony saying, not sure I got a ball out of that, me or him. Now, we didn't know, and he never said if he was voting Labour or not.
Yeah.
No idea, right? So I think, again, I would point to him as somebody where you can say, it's possible. It's possible. You can be into the debate, and here's the other thing. I think sometimes, it's yes, you can get too close. So am I suggesting that, for example, you endorse candidates, endorse parties? No, I'm not. Mm. What I'm saying is that you engage in all the debates that are of significance to public policy. Mm-hmm. So that might be, look, infrastructure, right? If you're saying that if you were in a position of thought leadership saying that one of the best ways to get through the economic mess that COVID is creating is to maintain a commitment to big infrastructure projects around the world, is that a political statement? I don't think so.
Yeah.
That's an argument. That's an argument about the economy. Yeah. So I think you just have to be wary, but don't be so wary that you think, oh no, we better not put our head out there at all.
And one of the best Arup stories, perhaps of the modern era at least, was the story behind High Speed 1, where we were advocating for the building of that railway with the government of the day. The government of the day, as the story goes, before my time, wasn't that interested. And of course, the tactic that we then deployed was to advocate it to the opposition of the day. And as soon as the opposition took it on board, made the announcement that they were going to support high speed rail, then the government of the day actually sort of came round, and the project happened as a result.
Right, well, so that's for our system. Yeah. And then there will be, you can go to other countries where you don't have the same sort of significance of the official opposition within our system. That will be a different strategy. So that's a very good example, I think, of where you would deploy that strategy in one system, but not necessarily in another. So
related to that, and one of the questions here is in the light of Brexit, And the fact that as a European organisation, European-based company in the UK at the moment, Brexit sort of rather separates us from the continent. How do we gain, continue to gain the kind of influence we do have with this separation occurring? Do we take much more of a European stance? Is if we see one as the government of the day and the other as the opposition, do we actually start to position ourselves more on the European side of the argument, if you like?
What's the base? What's the share of your operations, David?
I'd say we have about 6,500 staff here in the UK and about 2,000 in Europe.
Okay.
Across multiple countries in Europe.
Right. Well, I would say within the political environment, the political debate, then I definitely think you need to up the profile within the European context, because look, I'm not saying that politics governs everything. It doesn't, but it's incredibly important. Mm-hmm. And I think the next decade or two, that what happens in the European Union, that is where a lot of these bigger debates that apply to America, China, the rest of the world, that's where they're going to be happening.
Yeah.
So I'd be very worried if you were too UK centric in terms of how you're entering those thought leadership debates.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's a regular discussion we have at group board level. Are we too UK centric? We need to move. We need to recognise that. We need to be more international in our focus, and increasingly we have become so. I
think I remember Gerhard Schröder when he was German Chancellor. I remember him saying, this is long before the word Brexit, I think, even existed. But I can remember him saying, he says, something very weird about your country. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's just any country that has a press like yours is weird. Now, I think it's impossible unless you force yourself not to be influenced by the nature of the debate. It's quite difficult not to be. Now, if you go to Europe, European mainland, as it were, it's a very different sort of debate. You can enter thought leadership much more easily than you can here.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think you should do more of it.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay. Let me turn to another point here. There's a question here which is quite interesting. The kind of inherent conflict at the heart of government, where governments are lobbied hard. In many cases, political parties are funded by industries which perhaps really sit in conflict with where we would like the world to be going, if you like, in terms of particularly, let's take energy transition away from fossil fuels as an example. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that kind of pressure? On the one hand, the government is being lobbied hard over here. We're trying to push the other. We don't have the political might. We certainly don't have the financial might. How do we kind of achieve the same kind of balance in the arguments, if you like, that we need to portray?
Why when you say you don't have the political might, because?
Perhaps because of what you've described. We haven't invested in that to date, and we need to gain it fast.
Well, the fossil fuel industry has invested massively, and look, who knows where it's going to pan out, but I often think about the smoking debate. I mean, look, if we were doing this interview 20 years ago, the chances are we'd both be sitting here having a cigarette.
Yeah.
If we did that now, we'd be breaking the law.
Yeah.
One of the reasons it took so long for that change to happen was because the tobacco industry had an incredibly well-funded and powerful lobby that had real influence on legislators around the world. But it's gone.
Yeah.
Now,
from parts of the world, although you read.
Okay, but I'm saying from here, they're now investing elsewhere. Yeah. Granted. So I think that this debate is kind of following that pattern. I think, and this is when I talked about Al Gore, talking about working around it.
Yeah.
You've got to keep going with the same arguments.
Yeah.
And I think so would, for example, should you as Arup, you as an individual, if you were invited to go up on a platform against somebody representing the fossil fuel industry, would I recommend that as a good thing to do? I would.
Yeah.
I would.
Yeah.
But you don't have to go up there and be abusive and be insulting. You have to go out there and project fact-based analysis. Because I'll tell you the other thing I think is happening, which is opening a wider door to business in this thought leadership space, is that 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Brexit, 20 years of Putin, there is a sense that the public kind of know. There's never been a halcyon age when they thought all politicians have told the truth the whole time.
Yeah.
But it's kind of gone to a different space.
Mm-hmm.
The desire for what I call long-form, fact-based, analytical argument, I think is very, very strong.
Yeah.
It's particularly strong with opinion formers.
Yeah.
So,
and the digital age,
in there.
You know, the digital age, to me at least, gives us that opportunity to be more evidence-based than ever, actually, in terms of the data available to us, what we can do with it, the analysis that we can apply to it.
Here's a thought for you with the Arab speech. Why haven't you got an Arab university?
We do.
Where?
Here in London, well, actually across the globe.
All right, why don't I know about it?
Good point. It is actually, it's something we're very proud of. We have a thing called the Arup University, works across the globe with all of our businesses, and is very much about focusing on excellence in what we do.
Right, but that's for Arup.
For Arup.
I'm talking about an Arup University where the philosophy that is sort of set out in that speech and that you've adapted and taken forward becomes the basis for education of others.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
So maybe call it the Arup Business School rather than, because if it's inward looking, it's about Arup people becoming better. That's fine. But I think actually you could get into a different place if you took it to.
Very interesting. The Arup Business School and the Arup Monitor.
Yeah.
I'm noting this down.
I noticed the British and Irish Lions question coming in and going out. I'm glad about that. Not my finest hour.
I'm trying to link it. There you are. It's back again. I'm trying to link the questions together. I'm not trying to avoid it. Maybe we'll come to that one. I think one of the things you've met some really extraordinary people in your time, and you've been part of some momentous events. You know, the one that I feel very strongly about is the Northern Irish peace process, for example. Are there some people that really stand out for you? People who, you know, come what may, and they're people who have, by doing that, have really, you know, exerted a degree of influence beyond others, if you like.
See, in the Irish context, it's really interesting because I'd say that I think you're talking about a lot of principled people, but they've all had to adapt.
Yeah. Interesting.
I can remember. So you take somebody like Martin McGuinness, who I became very friendly with on the Sinn Féin side. Now, you know, there's a guy who was, for all the kind of weasel words through the years, was a pretty high up in the IRA.
Yeah.
He had to move to a place where he would front up and see down people who still felt that was the way to go.
Yeah.
Now, they would argue he was being unprincipled because he'd given up the thing that they'd devoted their lives to. He would argue that he was adapting to change and he was pursuing his legitimate objectives in a different way. Yeah. And likewise on the unionist side as well, they all had to adapt. Yeah. I'll tell you, there's the person who actually popped into my head when you asked me that question in the Irish context was General de Chastelain, the Canadian arms decommissioning guy. Yeah. He just had to sit at a hotel for a few years and wait. And that's pretty impressive. Yeah. But I think most people, you know, something like Nelson Mandela, you think, you know, that is, you know, to go through what he went through and then come out of it without bitterness. Yeah, and with that sense of forgiveness, and because he wanted that, he was chasing that greater good. I mean, he's probably got to be up there as the one that stands out. And
how, you mentioned there a couple of personal relationships, your relationship with Martin McGuinness, for example. You know, how important are those personal relationships? You know, we all look at, you know, government on our TVs every night kind of thing and think, you know, that this is about almost big corporates relating to big governments, you know, but actually at the heart, presumably the personal relationship still carries a huge amount of value.
Well, I wrote a book on the peace process, and I said at the start, if you asked me how that all came together, I can tell you what happened. I can tell you at this time this happened, and at this time that happened, but I couldn't tell you why it all came together in the way that it did. Yeah. And there was a magic about it that I think actually was rooted in the characters and the personalities. Yeah. and in what happened, the meshing of these relationships. So, for example, the fact that Tony Blair was the Prime Minister here and Bertie Ahern was the Prime Minister there, they got on.
Yeah.
There was a kind of thing there. The fact that Bill Clinton was in the White House and he said, "You wake me up anytime, day or night," and he meant it. Yeah. You didn't have to worry about that. The fact that Adams and McGuinness at roughly the same time decided, no, we're going to do it differently. The fact that David Trimble was the leader of the Unionists at that time. Yeah. The fact that Ian Paisley was shouting on the outside, but eventually came in. So those personal relationships, they're fundamental. They're fundamental.
And trust must have built between you.
Well, trust and mistrust. The mistrust is important as well. I think, for example, you were saying earlier, you think that there'll be a deal. There might be. But I'll tell you, they don't trust Boris Johnson. And one of the reasons they don't trust him is because he has shown a commitment to saying he would break the agreement they've already made in the withdrawal agreement. That puts him at a disadvantage. Yeah. So, yeah, now, look, I can remember particularly in the European context, but also Ireland, you need to be able to, it's like any other walk of life, you need to be able to walk into a room, sit down with somebody and be able to make things move. Yeah. And you can only do that if there's a kind of sense of chemistry there. Yeah, excellent. I've got a tricky one for you. Go on. Have you ever questioned the morality of the messages you've communicated? And how do you feel about that? Have you successfully influenced the leaders asking you to communicate those policies? Have I questioned the morality? Yeah, I mean, have I questioned the morality in that I would never, because I couldn't, if I was asked, for example, let's just say that Tony Blair decided in his wisdom we were going to have a referendum on the death penalty. I couldn't have defended that. And I wouldn't have defended that. I'm guessing that somewhere in the back of that question is probably Iraq, because that's the one that we get asked about all the time. Yeah. Did I question the policy? A lot. Did I probe Tony Blair as to whether he really thought this was the right thing to do? A lot. Yeah. Was I able to support privately to myself and publicly go out and defend the policy? Yes. Based in part on that kind of rigorous questioning, if you like. Is there a moment perhaps during your time in government which really stands out for you where you successfully shifted the outcome, perhaps? You know, you used your own influence within government to shift the outcome of government policy, move it into a better place in your mind? I don't think so, because I don't, I'll probably get in the car and 10 minutes later, oh yeah, no, not, there's none, because I never, we were talking earlier about Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's advisor, who's recently departed. I never had my own agenda in the way that I think he did. Yeah. And he, you know, I think sometimes he was using Johnson when Johnson thought he was using him. Yeah. I never had my own agenda. Now, there were things that I would sort of feel very strongly about, but I can't, there's nothing that comes to mind where I think, maybe Kosovo, I was very seized of the fact that the communications were fundamental to the strategy, and therefore maybe I inserted myself more. But no, I can't think of anything where I changed policy, no. So one of the things I think you probably really stand out for was the ability to create and then stick to a sustained message, and I think it really changed the way I think governments communicated with the populace, if you like, and that there was a sustained message, and it actually helped the public understand what the government of the day was trying to do. Would you offer any advice to an organisation like ours, perhaps when we're advocating change? How do you go about the process of kind of zeroing in on that message and then sustaining it over time? Because I think one of the things we're always guilty of actually is, you know, being clear about the message today, but then being distracted by something else tomorrow and sort of almost diluting that message as we go forward. Well, that's why I go back to the point I made right at the start, that in the end, the message has to flow from the strategy. So our message was modernisation. I always say a good strategy, you should be able to sum it up in a word, a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph, a page, a speech and a book. Yeah. Okay. Our word was modernisation. Our phrase was New Labour, New Britain. And if what we were doing didn't speak to that, then it didn't fit. And so it's not a question. And here's the thing, you say it's changed the way that governments operate, and yet I think governments are becoming less strategic, and they're confusing communicating the same message with saying the same thing again and again and again. Right? So Theresa May's election campaign, strong and stable, strong and stable, strong and stable. Well, saying strong and stable is not a strategy. Strength and stability is a strategy, providing the policies flow from it. So the key to it, and the other thing I'd say, when you say that you have a message, then you go off it, everybody does that, and the reason they do it is they get bored. So I would say to you, particularly, I mean, government, if you're Trump or you're, you know, the European Union or you're Putin, you're out, you can be out there the whole time, okay? If you're a company that's not out there the whole time, hang on to this thought. Just when you, the communicator, are getting bored with saying something, there is the outside possibility that the message is beginning to penetrate the outer rim of the radar of public consciousness. So don't get bored.
Keep going.
Keep
Very
going.
good. I want to turn, we've got only a few minutes left, and there are a few questions about your role in really championing the mental health cause. I think today, you know, we're an employee-owned company. We care a lot about the members of Arup, and I think, you know, it's been a particularly difficult time for a lot of people being at home for such long periods. You know, I've read a bit about your coping strategies that you've deployed for yourself. Is there something you could advise our staff as to how best to really think about how they get through and become, I suppose, take themselves out of this period of lockdown, you know, and look back on it perhaps as a positive experience? Is there something we can do there to deploy tactics that we can use? Well,
as you know, I've written a book about depression.
And it's on my Christmas list.
On your Christmas list? Well, I've actually brought one for you because I'm a nice guy. But when I talk about coping strategies in there, I talk about my jam jar. So my jam jar, and this was given to me from a lady in Canada who I went to interview about genetics, whether mental illness is genetic. And it's a long story and a complicated story. The short answer is no, not in the way that some diseases are. She said, think of your life as a jam jar, okay? And down the bottom of the jam jar, you've got your genes, and that's the sediment. There's nothing you can do about that. It's just going to be there, right? Who your mum was, who your dad was, where you were born, what language you speak, that's what you were born with. Then the rest of your life fills up with good and bad, okay? And most of it goes in and it comes out because we don't remember most things that we do, and we don't remember most things that we say, and it just comes in and out. Good stuff that we remember and bad stuff that we remember, some of it stays in, and it all mixes up, and most of the time we can manage, okay? When we can't manage is when the glass is full, the jam jar's full, and it explodes, and it explodes into illness. And she says, what we do, we spend a lot of the time down here, the Freudians are all down here, trying to analyse, you know, what we thought about our mum and what we thought about our dad and all that stuff. And then the analysts, I live in NW3, which is the postcode with the highest proportion of psychotherapists and psychologists to head of population anywhere in the world, probably. They're all into sort of, what did you do last Tuesday and what did that make you feel? And she says, it goes about it the wrong way because you can't undo any of it. Grow your jam jar, okay? So when she said it, I sat doing what you were doing and nodded, but part of me was thinking, what the hell is she talking about? But I had a eureka moment a few days later. What she was talking about is build onto it the things that you can do something about. So I got up in the middle of the night and I drew my jam jar. It's all in the book with a little drawing. FFF. FFF stands for Fiona Family Friends. Key relationships. Get your key relationships strong, work on them, your jam jar's growing. MA, meaningful activity. And I had a dotted line through my meaningful activity that pays the bills,
Yep.
gives you nice holidays, gives you a nice house, lets you go to Burnley every weekend to see the football when we can get back to that, but also meaningful activity that changes the world, if you like.
Yeah.
That's important to me. Then I go into my fundamentals: sleep, diet, exercise. I never used to care about sleep. I used to think sleep was a waste of time. Now I get as much sleep as I can. Diet, I look after what I eat. Exercise, I do it every day. Then I'm into the things that are personal to me. Burnley Football Club, bagpipe music, Elvis Presley, Jacques Brel, Edith Piaf, Motown, whatever it might be, my dog. Then I'm into the themes, curiosity. If I'm feeling down, which happens quite a lot, if I'm feeling down on my depression scale, I always make myself learn something. And I always make myself do something that I didn't do the day before. And sometimes it can be hard, but every time I do it, I feel better. And the thing is, if you'd have said to me on the flight to Canada when I met this woman, "Oh, you're Alastair Campbell, you're always banging on about being depressed. How do you deal with that?" I would have said I take pills every day, which I do, and I see a psychiatrist, which I do. But when I drew my jam jar, they were right up here, and all this other stuff. And now when I get depressed, I have my drawing on my desk, and I tick them off one by one each day.
Very good.
Thank you.
It's a perfect analogy for me because I'm an avid jam maker, actually.
Are you?
Constantly looking for bigger jars.
Are you?
So I know exactly.
There you go.
Alastair, we've run out of time, so I really enjoyed that. We could keep going.
We avoided the lions.
Well, I haven't got
the guy with the lions question. You can email Tom Gray. Email me on my website, and we'll have a private discussion about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let me thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. We could talk for hours. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know Arup.
Yeah.
I hope perhaps there's an opportunity for you to get us to know a bit better.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Given us a huge amount to think about. And for those listening, I'd encourage you then to join our next event, which is next week, where we'll be talking to two of our non-executive group board members who have both had very different experiences outside Arup, and will be bringing their perspectives for us to hear in the way in which we might influence each other as employees and influencers within the organisation. Thank you very much.